Christina Cowger, and like Dave, who is my boss actually, I work for the USDA. I'm a small grains disease researcher, so I'm here to talk to you about all those fun things like smut and bunt and scab and rust. No, I'm actually mainly going to focus on scab today because I believe that in the Piedmont that is probably our #1 concern. And Dave was just talking to you about barleys, and if the craft brewing and malting industry really takes off, then there's going to be a lot more barley production. And scab is going to be a super big concern because, as you may know, Fusarium head blight, or scab, produces a mycotoxin called vomitoxin, and it is a fungus that loves all type of cereal grains, including corn, wheat, rye, barley, oats. And so we have to worry about scab in barley, where there is a zero tolerance for vomitoxin on the part of maltsters. And it's really hard to get down to zero vomitoxin in a scab epidemic year. Now, so we're going to be doing some screening of the barleys that Dave was showing you in Raleigh under misted nursery conditions where we inoculate with Fusarium head blight. And we're going to be looking at things like the best timing for fungicide application and the different levels of resistance to scab that those varieties exhibit when they're under severe scab pressure. Scab can be a problem for us any year. This year we seem to have dodged the bullet. If our wheat is already flowering or past flowering, then I think we're home free. If you live northwest of here, Raymond informs me that your wheat is still not flowering. And so it's important to keep an eye on that scab risk forecast until you're about a week or 10 days past flowering, at which point you'll be out of the woods. That web forecast is available from a website through the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some fungicide data financed by the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, which has been working for a couple of decades really to try to combat the scab pathogen. This is really an equal opportunity disease. It can happen to you any year that the weather is conducive for the 7 to 10 days before flowering. So the weather in the period leading up to flowering has to be rainy, the relative humidity high, and the temperature at least warm, if not hot. But even cool weather is conducive to scab if you have enough rain. So it's really that moisture, that relative humidity, that's key. Where is the scab pathogen hanging out? Well, find a piece of corn debris on the ground, and that's where the scab pathogen is waiting. So any little piece of debris, and we've got how many billion pieces like this in our landscape, harbors that pathogen potentially. And when flowering is about to occur, that is when the weather is critical, because when your wheat looks like this, and I know most of you know what flowering small grains look like, but the wheat needs to look like this to be vulnerable to infection by scab. So the little yellow things that come out of the heads, those are the anthers, and they will eventually wilt and turn white. During that period, when they emerge and until they turn white, is when the wheat is susceptible to infection. So that's when, if it's wet, the fungus that's in this piece of corn debris will mature its spores and will release them into the air, and they will swirl around. Most of them will land fairly locally, but some of them will be carried long distances. And research shows that it makes less and less of a difference if you till up the debris in your own field anymore, because there's so much other debris, corn debris and cereal debris in the landscape, that there'll be enough spores blowing onto your field that your own local tillage practices, while they may make some difference, are no longer going to determine whether you get scab. So that's not good news. You can get a little bit of a benefit from tillage, but that's not going to solve the problem. Fungicides are obviously important. And we get the question a lot, when should I spray? You tell me I should spray Prosaro or Proline or Caramba if scab risk is medium or high. That's yellow or red on that risk map. But how can I do that? Because it's raining out there, so it's really hard to get out into the field to apply the fungicide exactly when you need to apply it. Well, the best time to apply the fungicide is at early flowering. And if it's raining during early flowering and you can't get out into your field, then research through the Scab initiative, these are multi-location tests in about half a dozen states, has shown that up to 6 days after flowering, after early flowering, you will still get a benefit that is as good as or almost as good as early flowering if you apply the fungicide. Before flowering isn't going to help you. Why is that? Well, you need to be putting on a triazole, not a strobilurin, and I'll get back to that in a second. The triazoles are only locally systemic. They only move a small distance inside the plant from the spot where they were applied. So if your wheat is not headed yet, fully headed, then that's not going to help you. It's not going to translocate into that head once the head comes out. If the wheat is headed but not flowering yet, you might get some benefit, but it's not going to cover all the floral tissues, the flower parts, as well as it would if the wheat had started to flower. So the best time is early flowering to about 6 days after early flowering, with a couple days before flowering. It's going to give you some benefit, but not as much. Before heading isn't going to help. Why not a strobilurin? Well, tests have shown, again, this is multi-location data, that strobilurins applied either at heading, at flowering, or at about 6 days after flowering, you may, if there is scab in your wheat heads, you may get an increase in the vomitoxin as opposed to controlling the vomitoxin. It may help you a little bit with disease reduction. In other words, the symptoms may not look so bad, but the scab that does infect and spread within the wheat head, that is going to produce potentially at least more vomitoxin than if you hadn't put the fungicide out at all. So that's in comparison to an unsprayed control. So strobilurins are risky if you put them on anywhere near flowering if you get a scab epidemic. If you don't have a scab epidemic, then the strobilurin isn't going to harm you, and of course it may control other pathogens. So about 15 to 20 days after flowering is when you will see the symptoms of scab. The heads will be partially bleached. They may have some salmon or orange color on them where spores are being produced by the fungus, and that's how you'll know that that head has fusarium in it and vomitoxin as well. Now, if you get everything right with your fungicide, you still are likely to get only about a 50% reduction in disease and DON, and it doesn't seem fair. And that we've heard from growers in the Piedmont who last year followed all the recommendations. They planted resistant varieties, moderately resistant varieties. They sprayed them at the right time. They angled their spray nozzles at a 45-degree angle to drive the fungicide into the wheat heads at flowering, and they still had 7, 8, 9, 10 parts per million of DON, where the ceiling is 2 parts per million for food-grade wheat and 5 or 10 parts per million for feed wheat. There's no silver bullet for this disease. You get about a 50% improvement if you get the fungicide on at the right time. Moderately resistant cultivars as compared to susceptible cultivars, also probably a 50-60% improvement. In a bad scab year where it's wet, conditions are conducive, you're going to need both. One last thing I want to say about scab, there's starting to be more attention since a lot of small grain growers are applying fungicides on a preventative basis, a calendar application, whether or not they're seeing fungal disease in their fields. And some of the same fungicides are going out on corn as on small grains. And so the fusarium pathogen, which is omnivorous, it likes all these cereals, is maybe getting 1, 2, 3 doses of a particular active ingredient per year. So are we creating the potential where we might work ourselves out of a good control method for scab? If strobilurins are risky, we're confined to triazoles, and then if we start to see resistance to the fungicides among the triazoles, then we'd really be in a pickle. So there's a survey, very limited survey in New York, 50 samples of Fusarium graminearum from the field. One of the 50 was fully resistant to Folacure. Now, Folacure is not one of our top scab fungicides, right? We know that it's less effective than Prosaro, Caramba, Proline. Nevertheless, small sample, one isolate resistant, doesn't tell us a huge amount, but it does tell us that there is insensitivity out there. Studies are also going on in Indiana and other states as to Caramba and Proline and Prosaro, how much insensitivity to them is out there in the fusarium population. But I think this is something for us to pay attention to. We need to husband and manage the use of fungicides carefully while we still only have really one class of active ingredients to control this disease. Think about whether we need to be putting on applications in the absence of disease. Think about, are we rotating chemistry so that we're not always applying the same active ingredient to the same ground if we've got different hosts for the fusarium pathogen there. Are there any other questions about scab? Yeah.
Assuming you're getting 50% control, what would you call an economic threshold? At what point, let's say you're seeing no signs in the field, and you're maybe not even in weather patterns, you have no indication you're going to get it. But at what point do you look out at your crop and say, I've got to protect this? And at what point do you say, let it ride, it's not worth applying to control 50%? So at what yield potential would you say you trigger a spray no matter what?
Well, you'd have to look at the level of dockage that you'd be likely to receive if you missed the test weight standard and the DON standard in an epidemic. Our best advice is if the risk level is low, you don't need to go out at flowering with a fungicide specifically for scab. I mean, obviously, if you have other goals for putting out that fungicide that relate to foliar diseases, then you might decide that it's worth it anyway. But for scab in specific, we recommend applying a fungicide if there's moderate to high risk. If you have good yield potential, then I would certainly, if it's moderate risk, I would certainly apply a fungicide if the if the weather looks like it's also going to stay rainy for a little while. So I'd be happy to answer any other disease questions that people have. The research that you see in front of you is funded by the North Carolina small grain growers. There are 3 experiments here on Staganospora nodorum blotch, which is another fungal disease of wheat that some of you may have seen. So this is a disease of leaves and glooms, and it creates those lesions on the leaves, and they move up the canopy with splashy rainfall. And it's really when the flag leaf and the flag -1 are covered with lesions that you stand to lose yield. And it's really if the glooms become infected that you stand to have a negative effect on your test weight. We don't have real good thresholds yet for when it's economically beneficial to spray for this disease. We know we see a lot of it all over North Carolina, but it doesn't often reach really severe levels. So what we're doing here is measuring, this is my graduate student Lucky Mera's work. We're measuring different levels of straw residue on the ground because the pathogen comes from wheat straw. So we're looking at how much residue do you need to get a loss in yield and test weight. And we're doing similar work here in 2 other experiments to try to understand exactly how much disease do you have to have before you're going to lose a significant amount of yield or test weight. Are we spraying when we don't need to control this disease? When is the economic threshold really met? So we hope to have some data for you within about a year. That's what I had. Any questions? Yeah.
Our wheat is blooming now. In other words, is it far enough along that let's just say we get rain Monday? Is it going to cause any problem, or we're far enough past that we're okay this year by having this hot, dry weather now?
Your scab risk is currently low. I would say your risk of foliar diseases in general is pretty low, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but wheat around here looks pretty clean right now. There just hasn't been enough rain to promote disease development. You would have to have a week of high relative humidity, frequent rainfall, and good warm temperatures like we have now to make for scab risk at the end of that week, in wheat that's flowering at the end of that week. So if your wheat is blooming now, I'd say for scab, you you have no concern because your risk is currently low, and even if it rains for the coming week, it's too late for the rain to hurt you. Well, the breeders here can probably address it better. The question was, how long does it take for wheat to start flowering and then finish flowering? My sense is that if you look out at a field, it usually takes about a week from start to finish. But what do others here think? Dave?
That's about right. And the higher the temperature, the quicker it goes.
Right.
And the wheat head, when it flowers, it starts from the middle and then works its way to the end. So first, the middle part of the head will flower first, and then the two ends will flower.
So if you should look at, your wheat, this isn't wheat, but if you should look out at all your wheat heads and about 25% of those little yellow anthers are out, that would constitute early flowering. And it ought to take another 3, 4, 5 days and you should be at the end of flowering.